He guided America through 2 world wars. He helped define U.S. military strategy, shape nuclear policy, and stood at the center of some of the most consequential decisions in modern history. From trust-busting lawyer to Secretary of War, from Secretary of State to overseer of the Manhattan Project, Henry L. Stimson was present when the United States crossed the threshold from rising power to global superpower. But power on that scale always comes with a price. Stimson defended liberty abroad while approving injustice at home. He argued for the defeat of tyranny while helping unleash the atomic age. So was Henry Stimson a guardian of peace through strength, or one of the chief architects of the modern world's most dangerous weapons? Today on the JQA Treatment, we examine Henry Stimson's life before office, his role in diplomacy, his leadership during World War II, and the deeply complicated legacy he left behind. To understand Henry Stimson in office, you first have to understand the world that made him. He was born in 1867 into privilege, discipline, and expectation. This was post-Civil War America, of course, a nation growing in industrial power, elite confidence, and global ambition. Stimson came from the sort of world that believed leadership was not merely an ambition, but a duty. He attended Yale, joined the Skull and Bones, of course, and later graduated from Harvard Law School. That background mattered. Stimson was shaped by the East Coast's establishment, wealthy, Protestant, educated, and convinced that men of character were meant to govern. He was not a populist. He was not a showman. He was not a natural politician in the modern sense. He was something older, a patrician public servant who believed the nation had to be guided by discipline, order, and responsibility. Now, he entered elite legal practice in New York and built a reputation for seriousness and integrity. In 1906, he became U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where he pursued antitrust and corruption cases. That role made him look like the kind of Republican reformer who could be trusted with real authority. Conservative in bearing, but willing to use government power when he believed public order required it. Stimson was never a man of flashy charisma. What he projected instead was steadiness. He seemed reliable, sober, honorable, the kind of man presidents called when they wanted the public to believe that serious adults were back in charge. So in 1911, President William Howard Taft appointed him as Secretary of War. This was before the department became the Department of Defense, and the role was central to military planning and administration. And so he pushed military preparedness, officer professionalism, and institutional reform. So he pretty much took on that role of Secretary of War and made sure that war was at the forefront of William Howard Taft's policies, even though Taft at the time is more inclined to use this thing called dollar diplomacy, where he's more inclined to use money instead of military, but there's nothing wrong with having that military preparedness. And so the first stint as Secretary of War mattered because it gave Stimson a front row seat to the machinery of American power before the United States fully became a global military actor. He was learning how the state worked, how armies were organized, and how modern conflict would demand more than patriotic slogans. It would require bureaucracy, planning, industry, and cold discipline. One of the things that Stimson said of military readiness was a strong nation must be prepared, not for war, but for the defense of peace. And this is usually how people in this position try to justify things. It's not war, we're not being aggressive, we're just defending in case we need to go out. We're defending peace. So when Herbert Hoover came in the late 1920s, he brought Henry Stimson back into government as Secretary of State in 1929. The timing could not have been worse. The global economy was collapsing, international cooperation was weakening, revisionist powers were testing the boundaries of what the world would tolerate, and the old hope that the First World War had made the world safe for peace was beginning to rot. Now, Stimson entered office believing in law, order, and international norms, but he was about to discover one of the defining realities of the 20th century. Principles mean little when aggressors are willing to use force and the democracies are unwilling to stop them. Take, for example, the Manchurian crisis. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria after the Mukden incident. Japan then set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. This directly challenged the post-World War I international order. And so the next year, in 1932, Stimson declared that the United States would not recognize territorial changes achieved by force, and this became known as the Stimson Doctrine. It was a statement of non-recognition, rooted in the idea that conquest should not be rewarded with legitimacy. On paper, it was a principled stand. It said that if aggressive nations could simply seize territory and have the world shrug, then international law was meaningless. Stimson wanted to preserve at least the moral line. Conquest would not be recognized as rightful sovereignty. But here was the problem. Japan didn't care. And the United States, in the middle of a depression and still deeply shaped by isolationism, had no appetite for war in East Asia. So the doctrine drew a line without enforcing it. So it sounded strong, but to Tokyo, it was mostly words. It showed Stimson's belief in a rules-based order. It also exposed the weakness of diplomacy without force. The doctrine later influenced U.S. policy against aggression, but in the moment, it failed to stop expansionism. So this is one of the great tensions in Stimson's career. He understood that aggression had to be resisted, but he was serving a country not yet willing to pay the cost of resistance. And so the result was a policy that was morally serious, but strategically thin. Stimson also supported arms limitation and diplomacy, but the broader interwar world was sliding toward militarism. Germany, Italy, Japan, all moving toward more aggressive paths. Stimson was trying to defend an international order that was already cracking. He could see the darkness gathering, but he could not stop it. That failure would shape everything he did in the next decade. He's quoted as saying of international law that the world must reject the path of conquest lest we fall again into darkness. In 1940, with Europe already at war and the United States inching toward direct involvement, Franklin Roosevelt reached for experience. He chose Henry Stimson, a Republican elder statesman in his 70s now, to serve once more as Secretary of War. So this is a guy at age 73 now, returning to office, not as a relic, but as one of the most powerful men in government. And so in the years that followed, he would oversee mobilization, supervise massive expansion of the army, influence strategy, and help manage a war unlike anything the United States had ever fought. Now, he supported the first peacetime draft in American history, backed rapid industrial mobilization, and then he helped prepare the United States for a two-ocean war before many Americans fully accepted the war was coming, and this is all preparing America before Pearl Harbor. Stimson was part of the group that believed that the United States could not afford wishful thinking. He understood that the oceans were no longer guarantees of safety. Air power, mechanized armies, and global empires had changed the rules. If America waited too long, it would enter the war unready. So after Pearl Harbor, once the U.S. entered the War Department exploded in scale. Stimson became a civilian manager of immense military bureaucracy. He worked closely with George C. Marshall, and through the War Department, he touched nearly every major front of the war effort. He was not commanding troops, of course, in the field, but that should not fool us into minimizing his role. Stimson helped shape the conditions in which generals operated. He was part administrator, part strategist, part political buffer, and part moral justifier for decisions that would affect millions. He oversaw personnel, procurement, logistics, and military coordination, was connected to high-level planning for both Europe and the Pacific, and helped manage the transformation of the U.S. into an arsenal of democracy, as FDR would say. World War II was not won by battlefield courage alone. It was won by production schedules, transportation networks, command structure, technological investment, and the ability to sustain campaigns on a planetary scale. Stimson stood in the middle of that system. He helped make total war administratively possible. Now, no examination of Henry Stimson can avoid one of the ugliest chapters of his career, the Japanese American internment. Now, after Pearl Harbor, fear, racism, and military pressure drove support for removing Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Over 120,000 people, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly relocated and imprisoned. Now, it wasn't just Japanese Americans that were a part of this Executive Order 9066, but a majority of them were Japanese Americans. And he expressed reservations at points, but he ultimately supported and signed off on the policy framework tied to this executive order. He accepted military necessity arguments, and he did not stop the policy. Nor could he, really, because it was an executive order, right? So this is where the language of wartime necessity becomes dangerous, because Stimson was not a wild-eyed demagogue. He was not an open bigot in the crude style of public agitators. And that is exactly what makes this so important. Internment was not only the work of obvious extremists, it was enabled by serious men in high office who convinced themselves that constitutional rights could be suspended for security. He later carried the burden of many wartime decisions, but internment remains one of the clearest examples that prudence and intelligence do not guarantee justice. He's quoted on saying on military necessity that preservation of national security requires difficult decisions, some of which history alone will judge. And boy, have people judged history. And so if internment is a moral stain on Stimson's legacy, the atomic bomb is the event that made his legacy world historical. World historical. As Secretary of War, Stimson oversaw the Manhattan Project, the vast secret effort to develop atomic weapons before Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan could do the same. This was not just another weapons program. It was a transformation in the meaning of warfare itself. He was one of the very few senior civilian officials fully briefed. He understood the bomb was not merely a bigger explosive. He grasped that it would alter diplomacy, war, and the future of civilization. Now, Stimson was not simply told about the bomb at the end. He was involved in the high-level oversight of the project and in the discussions about how this new weapon should be used. He knew that once unleashed, there would be no going back to an older world. He believed ending the war quickly was essential. He feared a costly invasion of Japan. He accepted the argument that the bomb could shock Japan into surrender, and he was also worried deeply about the long-term implications of nuclear weapons. His thinking combined military calculation and moral anxiety. He believed the bomb might save American and Japanese lives by preventing an invasion, but he also knew that humanity had crossed the threshold. The same man who defended the bomb as necessary also described it in apocalyptic terms, as if modern civilization had created something it might not be able to control. So Stimson had to defend, basically, the bombings after the war. He argued they shortened the conflict and prevented even greater bloodshed. Now, critics then and now argue Japan was already near defeat and that the bombings inaugurated a horrifying new era of mass civilian destruction. One detail worth adding, because it kind of humanizes him, is that Stimson reportedly opposed targeting Kyoto. Recognizing its cultural and historical importance, Kyoto was removed from the target list. Now, that doesn't absolve him from the other decisions that he made, but that was something that kind of makes him look at, see where he should be kind of looked as a human, and being able to say, well, its cultural and historical importance and the history behind Kyoto, maybe that absolves him a little bit, maybe it doesn't. It reveals something important, really, that Stimson did not think about bombing in purely mechanical terms, that he could be ruthless, yes, but he was not thoughtless. He understood symbolism, civilization, the weight of destruction, basically, which makes the final decision even more haunting. This was not ignorance, it was choice. On Hiroshima, he said, "The decision to use this weapon was the most difficult of my life, yet I remain convinced it was necessary to end the war." And I think that's something to think about as well, is that most people of the time also were convinced that it was necessary to end the war. We only look at it now, in the present, as something of like, well, they had another choice, right? The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, but they did not end Stimson's anxiety. So in some ways, they actually intensified it. He warned that atomic weapons had changed the world permanently. He understood the U.S. monopoly would not last forever. And he believed that the post-war world needed some form of international control, or at least sober statesmanship. He had helped open the atomic age, and unlike some triumphalists, he did not confuse victory with safety. He knew the bomb was not simply a tool America had used, it was a precedent humanity had set. He spent much of his life believing that disciplined statesmanship could stabilize the world. Now he had helped create a weapon that might make stability nearly impossible. So how do we remember Henry Stimson? Some of his successes are that he helped prepare and mobilize the United States for global war. He oversaw a major share of the administrative machinery that led to Allied victory. He played a central role in American statescraft across the multiple decades and articulated the principle that territorial conquest should not be legitimized. Some of his controversial failures, if you want to call them failures, which a lot of historians would, supported Japanese and American internment, could not stop Japanese aggression in the 1930s. He helped to usher in the atomic age and embody the contradictions of liberal internationalism backed by overwhelming force. So, he was one of those figures who cannot be reduced to a simple label. He was not a villain, and he was not cleanly a hero. He was disciplined, dutiful, and often serious-minded. He believed in service, law, and national strength. But he also approved policies that inflicted enormous suffering. He belonged to a generation of American statesmen who believed that wise men acting responsibly could guide the world through catastrophe. In one sense, Stimson did help guide the United States to victory in its greatest war. In another, he helped create the conditions of the most dangerous peace the world had ever known. So Henry Stimson helped shape America's war, its diplomacy, and its atomic future. He stood at the turning point where the United States became not merely a republic with power, but a superpower with world-shaping force. The question is not whether he mattered, the question is really what we do with men like this in history, men whose judgment helped defeat fascism, but those decisions also normalized internment and inaugurated nuclear warfare. So, did Henry Stimson secure peace through strength, or did he help build the architecture of permanent global danger? Next time on the JQA Treatment, we turn to Edward Bates, Abraham Lincoln's Attorney General, a key figure in Civil War-era legal battles and an often overlooked force in the fight over presidential power and emancipation. Subscribe now and leave a review. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning history.